Hello, dear students, and welcome back to this discussion on modern Indian history. The 18th century, guys, is a very fascinating century in our history. On one side, we see that many regional Indian powers are rising on the ruins of Mughal Empire and struggling amongst themselves. The strongest and most competent amongst them had the opportunity to replace the Mughals. We saw how Marathas came tantalizingly close to that. But parallelly, on the other hand, there is another set of powers. These are European trading powers who came to Indian shores. These European powers were also contesting amongst themselves. Motivated with the idea of monopoly, these powers wanted to edge out all other European rivals from the lucrative trade in India. And in their struggle, we will see that ultimately East India Company will emerge victorious. This is the saga of advent of Europeans in India that we have been discussing for the last two lectures. We have seen how in this process, first the Portuguese came to India and enjoyed a monopoly for almost a century. That monopoly was then shattered by the Dutch. The Dutch broke this monopoly and made Portuguese much less relevant than they were earlier. The Dutch then conflict with the English. The English were able to overcome the challenge of the Dutch and become the numero uno European power in India. But this domination of the English was contested in the 18th century by the bold and daring French. The French, through their ingenuity, were able to give a very big scare to British East India Company in India. The French devised such methods and techniques of interfering in Indian succession disputes and wars that would have led them to become the most dominant European power in India, but British doggedness prevented them from doing it. This is the story that we are going to see today as we discuss the history of French Company in India. So let's dive in and get started, guys. The French East India Company was established in 1664. This company was established during the reign of Louis XIV, whose picture you can see on the screen here. Yes, he is the great absolute monarch of France and not a comic character from a stage drama that you may imagine from his getup. Okay? He was the most powerful ruler of his time in Europe. He famously said, "I am the state and my word is the law." Much like what Shivagamini will say centuries later in Bahubali, "Mera vachan hi hai shasan," perhaps inspired from Louis XIV. This type of monarchy, that is absolute monarchy, claimed two things. Number one, absolute monarchy was based on divine rights kingship. That is, the king claimed a divine right to rule. And secondly, all the power was completely concentrated in the hands of the monarch, and there was no check on his power. No independent institutions, no judiciary, no media, nothing. All power concentrated in the hands of the ruler. Such was the rule of absolute monarchs of Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries, and Louis XIV is the best specimen or paragon of that type of monarchy. During his period, we see a very powerful finance minister by the name Colbert. Colbert implemented a series of measures which are collectively referred to as Colbertism. Now, Colbertism was nothing different from mercantilism, the same concept that we have discussed earlier in our previous lectures. I also have made a special video on mercantilism in my World History series. Link is there in the description box, guys. A key feature of mercantilism is monopolistic institutions. Just as the East India Company of the Britishers was a monopoly, the Dutch company was a monopoly. On similar lines, Colbert also takes such initiatives. The French company will also be a monopoly, but under a much more stronger state control. Back then, the idea was that the state must ensure that it exports the maximum possible, products and imports minimum. Import substitution should be practiced so that the trade surplus will be massive and that will lead to accumulation of wealth. That was the whole idea basically, guys. And with that intent, the French company also set out sailing towards the east and it came to the Indian shores. On coming to the Indian shores, it very much traces a similar path like its other European predecessors had. It went on to establish some factories in prominent trading places of India. The start obviously had to be at Surat, which was the most important Mughal port back then. We have understood already the importance of Surat in that day and age. Subsequent to that, on the eastern coast, the French established a factory at Masulipatam in 1669. So remember, this is the period of Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb. In 1673, they took a village called as Valikondapuram, which will later develop into Pondicherry, which will in due course become the headquarters of French in India and which continued to serve it till the French colonial presence was there in our country. In 1690, they established a factory at Chandernagore in Bengal, which will play a crucial role in the struggle against the Britishers in the decades to come. In 1693, the Dutch had briefly snatched away Pondicherry from the French. In Europe, all of these powers were constantly bickering and fighting with each other. There was constant internecine warfare amongst these European players. And very often this warfare used to find echoes in their colonial possessions. And therefore here we see that the Dutch and French also fight, and Pondicherry was briefly lost only to be restored later by Treaty of Ryswick. I want you to remember the name of this treaty because at times UPSC does ask such factual questions also. In 1701, finally, Pondicherry got the honor of being the headquarters of French in India. Even to this date, guys, if you visit Pondicherry, you will find very strong imprints of the colonial past of the French, rule. Now, having understood the importance of Pondicherry for the French, let me tell you that your foundation for civil services is also very crucial. Just as the French, would use Pondicherry as a launching pad for their ambitions, similarly, you also need a strong base to give wings to your civil services dream. And to enable you to do that, we are shortly starting our new P2I long-term batch for 2025. This batch targets the attempt of 2025. That's why we call it as a long-term batch. Now, a lot of you would be still pursuing your graduation or some other studies. Some would be working right now and would not be in a position to take 2024's attempts. So worry not. Your problem is sorted with the long-term batch. This batch is designed in such a manner that you have ample space to actually, help your preparation peak at the right time before 2025. If that is your plan for 2025, then you need to start right away and pace your preparation accordingly so that you will peak at the right time and also make the most of this period. I hope you're getting that. This batch includes all the key features that P2I foundation batches of 1 year have. It will include live classroom teaching, study material like the book that we are discussing right now, delivered at your address. It will include mentoring and hand-holding. It will include daily answer writing practice, daily current affairs sessions, weekly tests, both prelims and mains format. It will have a special leg of preparation for prelims exam to enable you to sharpen your prelims preparation as such so that you solve ample number of MCQs, you solve ample number of tests before the exam. It will include, like the P2I foundation batch, a mains residential program also. Those students who will clear prelims in 2025 will be invited for a all expenses borne mains residential program in Delhi, where in the presence of teachers and mentors, your mains preparation will be given the requisite muscle so that you can confidently tackle the main examination. This and many other, a plethora of features are included in this batch, guys. So in case you have a slightly longer horizon, then don't waste your time. Time simply flies, guys. The best way to make the most of the time is invest in your P2I long-term batch for 2025. You can use my code JD Live for this purpose so that you get a handsome discount on the course fee as such. In case you're wondering where you can get the PDFs of my notes, then you can scan the QR code and reach my Telegram channel where I regularly share my notes and other updates also. All the links to buy the book that we are discussing right now, as well as for admission purposes, are provided in the description box, guys. All right, now let us dive deeper into the history of French company in India. The French guys were fortunate to have a very dashing governor in the form of Joseph Francis Dupleix. Joseph Francis Dupleix will play a very crucial role in giving the French, a once in a lifetime opportunity, if I may use that phrase, to increase their influence in India to unprecedented heights. Let us meet this guy. Who was Dupleix? A great administrator, diplomat, and a born leader. Dupleix was posted to India and made Chief of Chandernagore from 1730 to 1741. Dupleix had a very keen sense of business. He ensured that the French company was doing well in terms of trade. Guys, I've told you in my previous classes also that flow of revenue is very crucial. Unless the revenue flow is smooth, various initiatives cannot be sustained. Dupleix understood this very well, and therefore he took great efforts, painstaking efforts, to ensure that the French company was doing well on the trade front first. He revived the trade of the French company, opened communication with different interior provinces in India from where Indian goods could be sourced, bought, and then sold in international markets. He also connected with other foreign entities like Persian Gulf, China, and Tibet, so that again trade could be maximized and French company would make good profits. He was, based on this achievement, as Chief of Chandernagore, he was appointed as Director General of Pondicherry in 1741, which was the topmost position of the French officials here in India. On reaching Pondicherry, he understood that Pondicherry was vulnerable to attacks by rival European players. And therefore, very wisely, he first undertook the fortification of Pondicherry so that it could withstand any future siege by a European or Indian power. Now, that is Dupleix for you guys. Now, this Dupleix is going to play a very crucial role in the Carnatic Wars or Anglo-French Wars that are now coming up. Before we get into the actual wars, we have to understand a little bit of larger backdrop of these wars. Why is it that Europeans who had come from such a long distance here to Indian subcontinent for the purpose of trade fighting here? Was it not enough that they were fighting in Europe? For centuries, they had been killing and maiming each other, ripping open each other's gut. But now, after having come such a long distance, they are fighting here also. Why is that so? The context of this is the same European conflicts that were taking place in the continental Europe. Those continental conflicts often found echoes in the distant colonial possessions of these European powers. And during the struggles of 18th century, we see that the English and French, I mean to say the countries over there, they were always ranged on the opposite sides. Much like what, the analogy is crude, but then to give you a sense, much like what the kind of rivalry that India and Pakistan share, we have a, history of, 3 wars that we have fought. Similarly, in case of Europe, these two powers, the English and French, had a long-standing feud or tussle going on. And therefore, very often, they found themselves on opposing sides in different European fissures. And because of that, when these companies are active here in India, India also becomes a theater of conflict for these companies. India will see warfare of these companies here because of European wars that were being waged. The Anglo-French conflict in India will start with Austrian War of Succession being fought there in Austria, Central Europe, and will end with another major conflict of 18th century in Europe, which is the 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War. We will now go into the details and try to understand actually what was happening between these two. All right. Before we do that, let us just have a quick overview regarding the location of these regions that we are going to talk about. This map is of around 1765. This region over here is called as Carnatic. Carnatic. So do not get confused with Karnataka. Okay, that's a different region, state, modern state altogether. Carnatic is on the eastern coast of Tamil Nadu. Okay, some interior area also, but primarily the eastern side of Tamil Nadu. Here is Carnatic. West of it is Mysore and Travancore. Above it is the territory of Nizam. This part, the coastal part of Orissa and Andhra, that was called as the Northern Sarkars during that day and age. Later, the British will take it over. We are going to see that story. This is what peninsular India looked during this time. So I want you to understand where this Carnatic is. Carnatic emerged out of the territorial administration of the Nizam itself. In the 18th century, taking the opportunity afforded by a declining Mughal empire, we have seen how the first Nizam asserted his control over this region. Subsequently, the in charge of Carnatic used the same logic that just as you have crafted your own independence from the Mughals, we don't find any reason to abide by your terms as such, and that will lead to creation of a separate administration of Carnatic, which will be headed by a Nawab, the Nawab of Carnatic. So with this context clear before us, let us now dive in and see what is exactly happening here. There will be 3 wars that will be fought in this process: Anglo-French wars or Carnatic wars. The first war will be a brief one from 1746 to 48. And this will be just an echo of Austrian War of Succession. We'll try to understand limited details of what is happening over here and then see what actually went about in the war. The second war will be fought from 1749 to 54. So as we discuss, I want you to have a mental note and imbibe that in your subconscious mind that yes, the first war is from 46 to 48 and it is an echo of the Austrian War of Succession. The second war is from 1749 to 54 and it is local in origin. Immediately after the end of the first war, we see that some succession issues will crop up in Hyderabad and Carnatic, the 2 regions about which we just spoke. The French will try to fish in these troubled waters by aiding the rival sides who were the contenders for the throne against the incumbents. The French tried to enhance their sphere of influence and will be successful to a great extent. This will make the British very vulnerable and they will respond back and try to spoil the party of the French. That is basically the story of the Second Carnatic War from 1749 to 1754. And then comes the final flourish, the third war from 1758 to 63. This war, like the first one, see, this was because of Austrian War of Succession in Europe. This war will again be because of 7 Years' War that was fought in Europe. In fact, not just in Europe, across multiple continents it was fought because of differences in European powers. So echoes of that will be heard in South India in the Carnatic region. These companies had found it convenient for themselves to establish their zone of influence in South India. The declining Mughal influence made it easier for them to actually, continuously increase their powers in the southern part of the country. North India still, although Mughals had declined, but it still had very formidable rulers like Nawab of Bengal, Nawab of Awadh, so on and so forth. So in this context, we'll have to see these three wars. Let's get started, guys. First, we are going to talk about the first Anglo-French or the first Carnatic War. It is an extension of Austrian War of Succession, as we saw. Now, Austria is Central Europe, and Austria-Hungary was a very powerful empire back then in 18th and 19th centuries. This Austro-Hungarian empire, the core of which is German-speaking, was ruled by one of the famous dynasties of Europe by the name the Habsburgs. The Habsburg royal family will rule over Austria. Now, there was a succession dispute regarding Queen Maria Theresa, which led to a war in which Europe gets divided into two camps. In this war, France and England will be ranged on opposite sides. And in that context, they will fight here in India also. So we have to understand only a little bit of detail about War of Succession. Just remember, Austria is an empire in Central Europe. It's a powerful empire ruled by the Habsburg family. The Queen Maria Theresa's succession leads to a conflict in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Different European powers jump into that conflict for their own interest, and England and France are ranged on the opposite side in this conflict. That's sufficient for our modern Indian perspective. Now, what happens here in India? Here in India, the French naval presence was weak. Now, we have to remember this fact, guys, for modern India as well as world history. The English had an unwritten sort of a rule. The English, or the British people, since their homeland was an island, they did not require a very large army. Instead, they required a very formidable navy. And therefore, they had sort of an unwritten rule that navy must be as strong as navies of all European powers combined. All European powers. For the British people had this fear that a formidable European combination can come and attack them via sea route, and therefore they had to have a very strong navy, and this is something that they maintained. Now here in India, the French, who in any case did not have a navy as powerful as the British, they had a weak naval presence. Now this was an opportunity that the English could not go begging. The English used this opportunity to capture several French ships. Why is it happening? It is happening because of this same war, the conflict in Europe. So the French ships are seized. Undeterred, Dupleix called for help from Mauritius, where the French possessions were there, and with reinforced strength, Dupleix responded by capturing Madras from the British in 1746. Madras, as we have noted earlier, was the headquarter of the English on the east coast, and that place was captured by the French. This was a very big blow to British prestige. Nawab Anwaruddin of Carnatic. We have seen where Carnatic is. Madras is basically in that dominion. So in that context, Nawab Anwaruddin naturally felt angry that these European companies are fighting amongst each other, disturbing the law and order on his land, and therefore he strongly asked them to refrain from these fights. Now on the land, clearly the aggressor was the French company, since it had taken over Madras. So Britishers complained to Nawab Anwaruddin about this behavior, and Anwaruddin sent a strong army to punish the French, who were not in any mood to listen. This led to a famous battle, the name of which you must remember, Battle of Saint Thome. Battle of Saint Thome, in which Nawab Anwaruddin's large army was defeated by a small French force. A small French force, less than 1/10 of the size of the Nawab's army, was very easily defeated by the French. This was a big shock to Nawab Anwaruddin as well as other Indian powers, that a small contingent of European trained troops could easily defeat a big army of the Nawab. Superiority of European fighting techniques was at display in this war. Now, traditionally speaking, Indians had employed horseback armies, where numbers mattered more than your skills. This was the technique of fighting in India during medieval ancient times, where numbers, the swell of numbers counted more than the fighting strategy techniques, etc. Okay, whereas Europeans, who were constantly at war, had evolved much more superior techniques of fighting. They did not require big cavalry units. They were rather based on infantry tactics. Furthermore, the same kind of effect could be generated by lesser number of troops, provided that they were trained and drilled in a certain manner. Europeans had developed these techniques under Frederick the Great of Prussia. These were then picked up by other powers, especially the French. This war demonstrated the superiority of such troops, European trained troops, in conventional warfare. European trained Indian troops could be as effective was also very visible. Now, majority of these troops who were fighting under the French command, they were Indians who had been trained under the French. So it was clearly proven that if an Indian is also trained in this manner, then he can be also as effective as a European. So it was all about technique. It was not as if Indians were less brave or less strong. It was more about the fighting techniques and methods that were deployed. Internationally, this war, which was going on, the succession war of Austria-Hungary, that came to a close with Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. So remember the name of this treaty? Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, 1748. And with this, war in India was also halted, and Madras, which was captured by the French, was restored. English had captured a few ships. Dupleix responded by capturing directly the capital of the East India Company on east coast of India. Madras was taken over. But because of international reasons, whatever had happened in Europe, Madras was restored back to East India Company. This was the chain of events of First Carnatic War. Now, what is the significance of it? The first conflict or first war is ending in a draw. Neither side was able to get anything significant. The English had captured just a few ships, whereas the French had taken over Madras, but then they had to give it back. So both the sides are even Stevens on the paper. But French superiority on the land had been very clearly displayed in the war. They had been able to defeat the English, take over Fort St. George, keep their control on it, and defeat a big army of the Nawab. So the French had clearly demonstrated their prowess on the land. The English, despite their efforts, they failed to defend Madras through land come sea operations. They were not able to defend their headquarters. This war also highlighted the importance of naval power in the struggle to come. French navy was weak, and that is what had made them vulnerable. They had to call for help from Mauritius. The role that European navies will play in the decades to come was, red flagged over here in this war. Dupleix demonstrated great skills. He was undeterred when the English seized the French ships. He took advantage and gained control of Madras. He defeated the Nawab of Carnatic. It was not a small thing, guys. Nawab of Carnatic was a very powerful man for that day and age. Taking him on directly, defeating him, it required a lot of skill, daring, and initiative. Superiority of European trained troops had clearly been demonstrated in this war. That is the first Anglo-French or the first Carnatic War. This will be followed by the second Carnatic War almost immediately. But this time round, the context of the second Carnatic War is going to be very different. It will not be about European conflict. It will be about succession disputes here in South India. So let us now dive in and see what was exactly happening in the second Carnatic War, guys. Let us start. The First Carnatic War boosted the political ambitions of Dupleix. Dupleix could see how weak Indian powers were. Dupleix could see that his troops, that is European trained troops, were, they had outgunned, outmatched the Indian power, and he could then use it to his advantage. It was also a great advertisement for other, Indian princes who wanted to seek French help or support in their ambitions. So he is now poised for a very big role in Indian political scene, and he will not disappoint. Dupleix sought to outmaneuver the English. Dupleix realized that the English are very strong at the seas. Their navy is stronger. The company is much more nimble-footed than the French company. The French people, their possessions in different areas of Indian Ocean region, they did not respond as energetically as Dupleix would have expected. So he naturally sought the opportunity to outmaneuver the English so that he can preempt any future threat coming from the English. For this reason, he uses the policy of interfering in local disputes. He has the tool, that is his troops, French trained troops, which then he uses politically in local disputes. How does he do that? He does that in the succession disputes of Hyderabad and Carnatic. The two major states of South India, Hyderabad and Carnatic, as luck would have it for Dupleix, they go through succession dispute at this very time. Dupleix was able to see this opportunity and seize it, make the most of it. What does he do is what we are going to understand now. Now, this part of the topic has some facts, and that is why I'm trying to make it as streamlined as possible for you so that you can remember them. I'm not bombarding you with excess facts also, which will not be relevant for exam. And at the same time, I'm trying to structurize the facts so that it will become easier for you to relate and remember. So let us first see, guys, in this second Anglo-Carnatic War, what will be the structure like of belligerent and the contender and incumbent parties. Let's see that now. On one side was the Dupleix-stitched French alliance. Whom all did it include? Of course, it had French company, and then it had the contender Muzaffar Jung for the Nizamship of Hyderabad. Nizam Asaf Jah I had passed away, and that had led to a succession related dispute in Hyderabad. Muzaffar Jung was the contender to the throne. Similarly, in South, in Carnatic, Chanda Sahib was another contender for the Nawabship of Carnatic. The French company takes up the cause of these two players who are contenders, who will have to fight and snatch away the rule for themselves. Naturally, the French are providing their service of exceptionally well-trained troops in these conflicts with the hope that these rulers will then lavishly entertain the French company. That is the whole idea. In front of them or against them are their respective rivals. And who are these rivals? Nasir Jung in Hyderabad and Nawab Anwaruddin of Carnatic. So Muzaffar Jung wants to unseat Nasir Jung and Chanda Sahib wants to unseat Nawab Anwaruddin of Carnatic. This is what the struggle is going to be, and for this reason these three have come together to change the equation here in Hyderabad and Carnatic respectively. How they go about doing it? Now let us see that. This is the course of the war in which we are seeing the first stage. This is like the first act of the drama in which Dupleix' plans will work out, with poetic flourish. He will be successful with all his political goals. But in the second stage, there will be a kahani mein twist. What will that twist be? We're going to see it shortly, but let us see the first stage. What is going to happen here? In Carnatic, you remember in Carnatic, Chanda Sahib is the contender. he has French support. So Chanda Sahib, the French, they come together, Muzaffar Jung also, and they fight a battle called as Battle of Amber against Nawab Anwaruddin. Battle of Amber. And in this Battle of Amber, the three, that is Muzaffar, Chanda Sahib and French, this alliance is able to defeat and kill the Nawab of Carnatic, that is Anwaruddin. Anwaruddin. Now, Anwaruddin has a son, Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali, who, goes to the town of Trichinopoly and locks himself up inside in that fort so that, this alliance will not come and kill him. Chanda Sahib is therefore now declared as the Nawab of Carnatic. So the first goal number 1 of making Chanda Sahib the Nawab has been achieved. That is done. Okay, got this point? Now you have to go towards the second goal. The alliance has to go towards the second goal. And what is the second goal? Muzaffar has to be made the Nizam of Hyderabad. So in this context, again, there is a fight in which in December 1750, the rival Nasir Jung, the incumbent, is killed. And Muzaffar is made the Nizam of Hyderabad. This was the second objective. Objective number 1 achieved. Objective number 2 achieved. Now after this, both the players, Chanda Sahib and Muzaffar, they lavishly entertain the French, they reward them. Muzaffar surrendered some districts in northern Sarkars. If you remember the map, we have seen where exactly the northern Sarkars were. That is coastal area of Andhra and Orissa, the rice bowls of Andhra. Dupleix was appointed as governor of Mughal territories to south of Krishna. This was more of a honorary position. See how history is repeating itself. In Delhi, nobles were, bringing princes to the throne and playing the role of kingmakers. Now, as if that was not enough, in South India, a foreign trading corporation was bringing people to the throne and being rewarded lavishly after that. French army was posted under Bussy. Remember this name. This is an important name, guys. Under Bussy at Hyderabad. So this army was sent at Hyderabad, the well-trained army, with the ostensible goal of protecting Muzaffar Jung. This is the start of the Subsidiary Alliance system. This is the Trojan horse, guys, that was first used by the French and will later be perfected by the Britishers in the form of the British resident who was sent to Indian allies by the East India Company. The start is over here. Salabat Jung succeeded Muzaffar Jung. So one more name to remember for us here. Salabat Jung succeeds Muzaffar Jung after the former dies, and after he comes to the throne, becomes the Nizam, he again further rewards the French more lavishly. More gifts were given to French, more territories were given to the French. So this really enticed the French that what is the sort of opportunity at stake. If they can use their tool effectively, what was their tool? They are well-trained, European-trained armies who were very effective in warfare against traditional Indian armies. If they could interfere in disputes and support one rival Indian power over another, then a lot of riches awaited them in this process. This was the master stroke of Dupleix. This is the first act of this drama. I hope you were able to relate with this first act of the drama. While all of this is happening, the East India Company had remained rather indolent. It did not really seize the initiative and try to do something about it. Until one man very desperately felt that something has to be done. And who was that man? That man started his life, as Bob. He was known as Bob in his family. He was a problem child for his parents, going about, fighting with other boys, creating a lot of ruckus, a very aggressive chap, in your face kind of, very daring, very, you can say brave, but at the same time, very, you can say, dominating kind of a person. That Bob had become such a big headache for his family that his father decided that he will rather send him to East India Company several thousand nautical miles away, so that he will not be bothered about all the headache that he keeps on creating. This Bob was no other than Lord Clive, who came to India as a mere writer in the East India Company. Now, who was a writer in East India Company? A writer was like an accountant, a bookkeeper for East India Company, who was supposed to maintain records. That was the lowest position for an Englishman to have in East India Company here in India. Below that, you had Indians who were serving the East India Company. So he was a mere writer at that point of time. This person, very strongly told the governor of Madras that if we don't do anything about the situation, then our position will become vulnerable. Dupleix' success had created a grave threat for East India Company, British East India Company. Remember, they now have the Nawab of Carnatic and the Nizam of Hyderabad in their pockets, literally. These two people, they owe their existence to the French company. Now, why would the French, after this, allow the East India Company to have a very good life in southern part of India? Of course, they won't. So, EIC was extremely vulnerable. That is when Lord Clive very fervently told the governor of Madras that we will have to intervene at this point and take up the case of son of Anwaruddin, Muhammad Ali. Now, understand the politics over here. Muhammad Ali, son of Nawab Anwaruddin of Carnatic, who had died against Chanda Sahib. Okay? His son Muhammad Ali had taken refuge in the town of Trichinopalli. In the town of Trichinopalli, he has taken a refuge. Okay? Lord Clive says that we will have to take up the case of Nawab Anwaruddin's son Muhammad Ali and get him back to the position of Nawab. That is the only way our possessions here in Madras and other parts of the coastal South India can be safe. So the governor asked, how should we do that? He said that, see, Chanda Sahib and the French, they have attacked Trichinopalli to get rid of this guy Muhammad Ali. And very soon Muhammad Ali will succumb and they will kill Muhammad Ali, and after that we will not have any chance. So the governor asked, so what should we do? He says, we will take up the case of Muhammad Ali and relieve him. But then the problem was Chanda Sahib and a huge French army were there. And Britishers did not have that big an army at that point. So he asked Clive's situation is not ripe for us to help him out in Trichinopalli. Clive says, we will use diversionary tactics. What kind of tactics? He suggests a counter move. He says that give me a few hundred soldiers and I will make a surprise attack on Arcot and not on Trichinopalli. There's an old, saying in Hindi, kahin pe nigahein, kahin pe nishana. So Arcot will be attacked by Lord Clive and British soldiers, so that Chanda Sahib will be compelled to back off from the siege and come back to his capital. That's the idea. August 1751, Clive captured Arcot, the capital of Nawab of Carnatic. He locked himself up inside the fort, and for next several days or weeks rather, Lord Clive withheld from within that fort. Chanda Sahib lost nerve and he left Trichinopalli for Arcot. He came back to Arcot to get back his capital from the British. And remember, inside it was just Clive and 200 of his British soldiers. British as in, of course, there were Indians also in that. East India Company's soldiers. So with just 200 soldiers and a lot of daring, a lot of aggressiveness, Lord Clive was able to hold back Chanda Sahib from entering into his own capital's fort. 1752, strong English force led by Stringer Lawrence relieved Trichinopalli, and that is how Muhammad Ali was saved. This upset the balance completely. French force that was at Trichinopalli, that surrendered. Later on, Chanda Sahib was killed by Raja of Tanjore because they had their own conflicts. Anyways, we don't have to go into that much detail. Remember that Chanda Sahib gets killed in all the confusion after this. Okay. This led to a big reversal for the French. Their favorite Chanda Sahib, who had been made the Nawab of Carnatic, had been killed. Now in his place, Muhammad Ali, the rival, had been brought to the throne by East India Company. This led to a loss of prestige for the French. Dupleix, unfortunately, was called back by the French government. This was the biggest mistake that they did. Okay, this is like, you know, what we call in Hindi is apne pair pe patthar marna. This is what the French did. They dug their own grave by calling back a man as skilled and as, you know, insightful as Dupleix. French surrendered at Trichinopoly, and in his place, a replacement, in place of Dupleix, a replacement was sent in the form of Godeyu. Okay, so this is how the Second Anglo-Carnatic War ends up. But if you see it in, you know, balance, if you see the overall picture, it was like English had been able to get their person on Carnatic, whereas the French also had succeeded in having their favorite installed in Hyderabad, and they had their military general Bussy posted in Hyderabad. So this was a significant achievement for the French despite the reversal in Carnatic. This is what transpired in the Second Carnatic War. Let us now summarize the outcomes of this war together. At the end of this war, a treaty was signed called as Treaty of Pondicherry. The war was largely again inconclusive because both the sides had gained something. It was not a decisive victory for either. The French were sitting pretty at Hyderabad, and the English had managed to get Carnatic under Muhammad Ali. The English had therefore succeeded in one of these struggles, whereas the French had retained influence at Hyderabad under Bussy. So both have got something. But nevertheless, the position that the French had earlier enjoyed in Deccan, that position had been undermined. So in that sense, the scale was slightly tilted in the favor of the English, we can say that. So they have a slight edge over the French, right? So this was the Second Anglo-French War, guys. Now after this comes the third and final season of this brilliant series. You know, this series has everything. It has war, it has action, it has courage, it has drama, it has intrigue, you know, conspiracies, everything is there in it. I wish, you know, Indian movie makers, Netflix and all of these actually consider this as a subject and make a beautiful series out of it. Coming back here to the third installment of this struggle, the Third Carnatic War from 1758 to 1763. This war is an echo of what is again happening in Europe. 7 years war in Europe will be fought from 1756 to 1763. This will again find echo in India. In 1757, Britishers had taken over Bengal after the Battle of Plassey. Having won the Battle of Plassey and had their favorite installed as the Nawab, the East India Company was at the peak of their success. They now had prestige, they had wealth, they had momentum going their way. And therefore, it was natural for them to look for the next opportunity to finish off their rivals, the French. This opportunity came during the course of 7 years' war. The French once again felt that they must seize the initiative and not allow the British to attack them. Before the British do anything, the French will take the initiative. Initiative is very crucial in war, guys. In this context, Count de Lally, the French commander, he attacked and took over Fort Saint David, which was an important fort on East Coast for the East India Company. So this starts hostilities. Bussy, who had been stationed at Hyderabad and through whom French had control over the Nizam of Hyderabad, was unfortunately called back by the French commanders. Now, Bussy being present in Hyderabad had ensured that the Nizam of Hyderabad was under the influence of the French. Once Bussy withdrew from there, then it created a vacuum which the Britishers exploited and got Nizam in their favor. They turned him into their favor. This hurt the French like nothing else. In the subsequent battles that were fought, there were many that were fought. In the most famous one, that is Battle of Vandewash in South India, 1760, the British were able to inflict a decisive defeat on the French. British commander Sir Eyre Coote, remember the names? Sir Eyre Coote captured the great Bussy alive and took him as prisoner. Now, Bussy was a very decorated French general who had in a distinguished way served the French as well as the Nizam of Hyderabad. Now, having Bussy himself captured alive and taken as prisoner was a big blow to the prestige of the French. Soon, Pondicherry also fell to Britishers after 8 months of struggle. Count de Lally, he stoutly defended Pondicherry for 8 long months, but when he did not get help from any side, ultimately the French defense crumbled and the Britishers were able to take over Pondicherry. Now, Pondicherry had been taken, and before that, other possessions also on the coast of the French, they were taken over, and thus the French influence was finally doomed. They had very brilliantly created an opening in India for themselves, but they ended up losing all of that to British doggedness in the Third Anglo-Carnatic War. Treaty of Paris was signed in 1763 in this context with the end of 7 Years' War. By the way, guys, this 7 Years' War was later referred to by Winston Churchill as the First World War. It involved all the major powers of Europe and was fought in different continents, including America and Asia. And therefore, Winston Churchill said that this should be considered as the First World War. Of course, that is not the case, but then I just wanted to emphasize the importance of this war in European history. And you can see it clearly had a very strong influence in India also. This war finally ended any possibility of French revival here. By this treaty, the 7 Years' War came to an end, and the Pondicherry and some other settlements of the French were returned to them, but on the condition that they will not be fortified. The French will not fortify these possessions. They were to remain under British protection and as mere traders in some of these places. They could not play any more role than that. This is the outcome of the Third Anglo-French War, guys. Now, it is imperative that we try to understand why the French were defeated in this struggle against the Britishers. What were the weaknesses of the French? Although the French were ingenious, Dupleix had devised this brilliant idea of using his European trained troops in disputes of Indians and enlarging the sphere of French company, but all of that got unraveled because of the British involvement. Now, what exactly were the weaknesses of the French? We'll try to understand that. Number one, French reliance on government support was very harmful. The French company was very much like a government department. It was under close scrutiny and control of the French government. And consequently, it had to always look over its back and see if the French government was happy with what it was doing. This led to lack of decisiveness in the officers in India. Consequently, and the fate that Dupleix had met after having done all that he had done, it naturally undermined the confidence of French officials here. Second, corruption and instability in France. Now, corruption was there across Europe, but then the French state had become particularly infamous for corruption and its inefficiency. Its luxury-driven ruling class, the first and second estates of France, they were not really best suited for this kind of a struggle against a state like British. The British state, on the other hand, was much more efficient, more effective, and consequently its effects could be seen on the East India Company. So the French company in that sense was a no match for EIC. So decadent French state was unsuited for these changing times. It was an absolutist state, whereas if you see in case of the Britishers, it had evolved towards, constitutional democracy. 1688, glorious revolution had already taken place. Voting rights had been enhanced. The rule of the king was limited by the constitution. Many such things had taken place. Whereas the French state was an absolutist monarchy where power was in the hands of the monarch only. Louis XV was ruling at this point. English held strategic locations in different parts of India. Unlike the English East India Company, which had factories in many different areas and consequently help could be accessed and reached from multiple directions, the French only had Pondicherry in that sense. And therefore, they were not having other alternative bases from where they could take help or they could seek refuge. That was a limitation, strategic limitation of the French. Then superior English Navy. We have already seen the importance English people attached to their navy. Being an island state, it was a necessity for them, and this served them, in a great measure during this conflict. Not just in this conflict, but throughout the colonial period, it was the British Navy that actually was the savior of the empire against other rivals. Commerce was often relegated to a secondary position by the French. The French always prioritized territory over commerce. In Europe also, later even Napoleon will make that mistake. Napoleon, for the sake of, a much smaller parcel of land, completely relegated the opportunities that were there in distant colonies. For the sake of controlling Europe, he lost the opportunity of building up a large empire like the British had done. The British, on the other hand, were very clear. Number one, finances have to be sound. They were very pakka professionals in that sense. The French, on the other hand, were not that professional. And consequently, the economic muscle as such of the French company was very weak as compared to the English. And on top of that, the government was not sympathetic. The government itself was inefficient and it could not pay for its expenses. British had superior commanders. Commanders like Lord Clive, Warren Hastings, Major Hector Munro, and many other, Admiral Watson. All of these are names, Sir Eyre Coote, whom we just spoke about. All of these are names of brilliant British commanders who played very decisive roles at key moments, and that enabled East India Company to survive and thrive. The French, on the other hand, apart from Dupleix and Bussy, they did not have any such, noteworthy commanders as such. Bussy also by this time had become quite old, and he was not the Bussy of his younger days when he was a famous military commander. By this time, he had lost that zeal of winning the wars. So these were the limitations of the French. Having seen the French, now let us quickly see the last European trading power who comes to India, that is the Danes. Now let us talk about the Danes briefly. The Danes, their company too was established in 1618, slightly later than the English and Dutch companies. They came to India and established factories at Tranquebar, Shridampur, Masulipatnam and Porto Novo. They were more interested in spread of Christianity than they were in trade. Ultimately, they realized the futility of their entire endeavor, which was not financially viable or sustainable, and therefore in 1845, they finally sold off their belongings and left India. So nothing significant or noteworthy as such can be mentioned about the Danish trading company. Lastly, we'll conclude our session by taking an overview of reasons for British victory. Number one, strong financial backup. The company itself was particular about its finances, and the British government too, time and again, stepped in and extended financial support to the company. Second, the English were on the cusp of an industrial revolution. We're talking about mid-18th century, guys. This is when James Watt has already perfected his steam engine. and the English are on the edge of very rapidly transforming their country into an industrial one, way before others could even get a whiff of it. And therefore, technologically speaking, they were much more advanced. The French, on the other hand, were very much steeped in medievalism, and therefore, technologically speaking, they were much more backward. Third is superior arms and military strategies. British cannon guns, British muskets, guns, etc. All of their paraphernalia for fighting wars was much better than the French. In fact, the Indian rulers, they used to have a lot of fascination for the English arms and weapons. In terms of military strategy also, we have seen the boldness of Lord Clive, how he was able to single-handedly almost turn around the entire war situation. The quality of leadership, we have already noted that, was much more superior than that of the French. Stable government back at home. Apart from Revolution of 1688, broadly you will see that the British structure was stable and it performed very well. Favorable commercial policies. The state was invested in the success of East India Company. The ruling elite of Britain had invested huge amounts in the shareholdings of the company. Consequently, they always stood by the best interests of the company and did not challenge them in any way. Then the Britishers had lesser zeal for religious conversions. Not that the French had, but then others like Portuguese and Dutch were conservative in that sense. They had used forceful religious conversions, which had made the Britishers appear to be much more, you can say, acceptable to the Indians. Vacuum of power in India, this is a very natural background cause. The fall of Mughal Empire and the inability of regional Indian players to rise up to that challenge gave the Britishers the opportunity to fill up that vacuum. Victory in the Carnatic Wars. The only European player who was of some consequence and could have prevented the rise of Britishers were the French. And the French were comprehensively defeated at the end of the Carnatic Wars, and they will never pose to be a threat or challenge to the Britishers. This became a crucial factor later. Lastly, the loss of colonies in America. The 13 American colonies finally bid adieu to their motherland when they declared their independence in 1776. A long war will be fought between the colonies and Britain, at the end of which in 1783, King George III will tell the British colonies in America, "Ja Simran, ji le apni zindagi." After that, the Britishers will become extremely more possessive about their possessions here in India. They concentrated all of their attention on the crown jewel, India. These became the reasons why the English were successful. On that note, let us close our long session for today. I'll see you in my next class, where we are going to come up with more interesting topics of the 18th and 19th centuries, guys. We are now entering into a very exciting phase of modern Indian history. We are leaving behind the last, you can say, leg of late medieval period and actually entering into that transformative phase where India will advance towards modernity. I'll see you in my next class. Do leave some love in the comment box and like this video, share it with your friends. Thank you.